Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Just sort of quickly, one of the things about the budget, so I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. I've done this for a long time. I'm one of those self-professed budget geeks, and I used to get very, very excited when the budget came out. I mean, I was one of those guys who looked forward to it, couldn't sleep the night before, was so interested in getting the numbers, because it really does, in some ways, it's supposed to set forth the administration's priorities on where they see our country going, both from revenues, from spending, from programs, how they want to make changes to education, to agriculture, to entitlements. It really is a document that's supposed to set forth who we are as a nation and where we go. It's questionable whether or not this document does that anymore, but this is where sort of we get interested in the budget and why it is. This is a statement of who we are as a country and what our priorities are for spending and revenues. So with that, if you have full copies of the handouts. I know sometimes it's hard to see on the board, so it might be helpful to look at the printout sometimes. Just today, we're going to discuss sort of where we are using the CBO baseline. We'll talk about the President's FY13 budget, sort of the spending, the taxes, the deficits, and the debt. We'll look at how our debt compares internationally. There's some questions about our debt levels right now and how that compares to other countries. And then we'll have a quick discussion at the end, sort of what the real bottom line is. So where are we? So first of all, as you know, being in Congress, the Congress uses the Congressional Budget Office as the official scorekeeper for the budget numbers. So this chart is from the Congressional Budget Office, and it shows historical revenues and historical outlays from 1970 and projected to 2020. Now, this is using the baseline projection, which means it's current law. So CBO does basically two things. One is current law, which they basically say we cannot tell Congress what you're going to do or what we think you're going to do. All we can do is look at what's in current law, which means if you look at current law, the Bush tax cuts expire this year, the payroll tax cut expires this year, the doc fix, the 27% cut in physician payments actually happens. All those things are assumed in current law to happen, and that's what CBO has to do for their current law projections. Because again, they can't tell Congress, hey, what you've done in the past, we can't really tell you what you think you're going to do, so do current law. Now they do other forecasts, and we'll show you those later, but for scorekeeping, everything's done off the current baseline. So you'll see with the revenues shoot back up pretty quickly next year. That's because the Bush tax cuts are assumed to expire. Yes?
So is this assuming sequestration as well?
Yes. So it is current law. So that happens as well, but you'll still see the spending goes up dramatically because of health care. But it assumes all that happens because of current law. So what also is interesting to look at is where we sort of are historically. The dotted lines going horizontally across, the red dotted line is average outlays from 1970 to 2009, and then the dotted blue line is revenues average. So what's interesting about this from a historical standpoint is that in the United States, we basically have a natural comfort level. I won't say it's causal, but I'll say there's what's called casual empiricism, where when we have revenues at 18% of GDP, regardless of the size of the economy, we seem pretty happy. When we get revenues above 18% of GDP, there seems to be calls for tax cuts in this country. When we get below it, the discussion changes to tax increases. And you can sort of follow the history there and see when we start having the 84 tax reforms, 86, 2000. They all sort of coincide. And of course, now we have historically low levels of revenue because of the recession. And of course, we have now calls for tax increases. From an outlay standpoint, you'll see that the long-term historic average is about 21%. We are spending way more than that now. Because of the recession and outlays for unemployment insurance and some health care issues. With the current law projections, though, you'll see that even if we know revenues aren't going to materialize the way they are, outlays are projected to be above 24% for the future. That's at least 3% of GDP, 3 percentage points of GDP above the long-term average. And a lot of people think that's not sustainable. But that's kind of the future we're looking at. And under current law, we still have deficits sort of as far as the eye can see. We are nowhere near to a balanced budget. So this gets us to the President's FY13 budget. Now, as we all know, this is where it's helpful to look at the actual handout and try to read it on the screen. One of the things when you get these giant documents, where do you start? So I always skip the introduction and all the hullabaloo, and I actually go straight to what's called the summary tables. This here basically tells you everything you want to know, the S tables for summary. And it points out everything you want to know about deficits, debt, programs to a share of GDP, what initiatives the President's putting forward and how those will affect the deficit or debt or raise revenues. So this one is table S1. First table in there, and it wants to highlight what we're talking about. What are we looking at for receipts? What are we looking at for outlays? And you'll see how this kind of goes through. I'm going to look at the bigger screen. Excuse me for a second. Because mine's too small as well. So what we have here is you see receipts basically going up to $5 trillion in 2022, outlays at $5.8 trillion. The deficit, they have projected to going to $704 billion. It's getting lower. And there are various numbers for debt held by the public. But what you see with all this, though, is there's big discussion about whether or not the president's cutting spending. There's a lot of discussion of I'm cutting spending. Well, spending actually grows by $2 million more than the budget window. So Washington's one of those interesting towns where a reduction in growth is considered a cut. You know, we're sort of math majors. We say if we spent $100 last year, a cut means we have to spend less than $100 the next year. Not in Washington. Washington base says we assumed we were going to spend $110, so we spend $108, we've just saved ourselves and cut $2.
But are those real dollars? Is this taking into account inflation?
It doesn't, no. So these are nominal.
Okay.
So the point is right. If you take into account inflation adjusted, so the budget will do two numbers. They'll do inflation adjusted GDP and nominal GDP. These are done in today's dollars, so you get an idea of what it looks like. So a good question is if we start saying, what is inflation per year? If inflation is going to be 3%, then you need 3% just to keep up with it. That's what they call current services baseline. The projections for inflation have been right around 2 to 3%, but the growth rate, if you look at the growth rate of GDP, they have it at 4.5%, 5%, depending on the year. So one of the interesting things, I don't have it on a table for you, but I have it in front, the Office of Management and Budget actually is using a little bit more rosier scenarios for the economic outlook than CBO does. And what that basically comes out to is that they are projecting the economy to be 3% larger than CBO will at the end of the budget window. And that makes a $1 trillion difference in our GDP, which makes the budget numbers look a little bit better for the president, but if you use OMB's numbers, it makes them look a little bit worse. So we try to always compare in some ways to CBO to see how they're doing for the outlook. So this budget grows by $2 trillion more into the budget window. Our debt, by the way, also grows. So one of the things about this is we have a $15 trillion gross national debt right now. If we're trying to cut spending or reduce the deficit, how do we actually do this? Well, over the budget window, our debt grows by $9 trillion if you just count debt held by the public, and over $10 trillion if you count gross debt, including the Social Security trust funds. So we're going from $15 trillion of debt to almost $26 trillion within the budget window. That's huge. And if you think about the idea of paying off that debt and the debt servicing, at the end of the budget window, our interest payments alone will be $1 trillion. And that assumes a very, very low interest rate. The general sort of consensus is that for every 100 basis points or 1 point increase in the interest rate we're paying, that adds $1 trillion in debt service costs over a 10-year window. So if we start seeing periods of heightened inflation in the next 10 years, these numbers are going to be understated, and our interest costs are actually going to balloon. So this is sort of where the president's basically going with this. He's saying we're cutting spending, but he's actually growing it by $2 trillion into the budget window. Debt's growing by $10 trillion. Interest payments go to $1 trillion annually. There's no real reduction in spending here. The revenues and outlays, by the way, stay above the long-term historical average. So there's a question now when you start looking at the long-term fiscal position of the United States and the budget the president's putting forward. Can this country sustain outlays greater than 21% of GDP? He has it at 24. And can this country contain and sustain tax revenues that come in higher than 18% of GDP for a long period of time? And it's a question whether that can happen. So this just sort of takes the previous table and sort of puts it into a chart so you can see how we're looking for deficits and spending. This goes back a few years. So again, deficits are not just a Democratic problem, they're Republican problems too. We have a spending problem in this country, but I want to show you sort of long term, even if all the president's wish lists come in and we were to adopt the president's budget as is, we are still going to have deficits over the next 10 years. If you start looking at the hearings that have been going on with Jeff Zients and Timothy Geithner, Secretary Geithner, when they're asked when is the budget balanced, they don't have a number for you. This budget never balances. It's deficits as far as the eye can see. So we're not making it, there's no credible plan here yet to actually reduce outlays and reduce the debt. And that's from the problems. We keep adding to the deficit, which means we're adding to the debt, and that long-term debt is not getting paid off. So this is a chart that shows the public debt held under various levels. And what I kind of want to point out, so the very top line, by the way, that's the Congressional Budget Office alternative fiscal solution, or fiscal scenario. So again, I told you we use current services baseline that assumes current law. CBO also, because they realize that oftentimes what happens in law doesn't actually end up being law going forward, they will do an alternate scenario to tell Congress, if you don't stick with what you have planned in current law, here's what might happen. So this now assumes, the alternative fiscal scenario assumes that the Bush tax cuts don't expire, that they at least get extended, that we have an AMT patch, that we have some sort of, we extend the doc fix, so it doesn't actually happen. So these things all get included, and you see all of a sudden the debt held by the public under the alternate fiscal scenario by CBO drastically increases. In my view, that's our realistic future. That's what we're looking at. We've already seen that we're not going to allow physicians in Medicare to take a 27% haircut in payments. We're not seeing the payroll tax. I don't think we're going to let it expire at the end of the year. I don't think the Bush tax cuts and all are going to expire at the end of the year either. So in some ways, that's our reality. When you look at the other features, these look at how various proposals from the House Republican budget, the fiscal commissions, and the president's budget submission in September as part of the BCA had various plans to debt to GDP. What's interesting is the president's current FY13 budget has larger deficits going forward than he proposed just back this last September. So again, this budget really isn't a credible plan going forward to reduce deficits. It's worse than it was even in September, and that's just a few months ago. So it's not even trying to put forth a good faith effort. And again, we're nowhere near paying off debt. So this really, if you look at sort of our budget, we really do have a spending problem. Regardless of whether you think we need more revenues or not, the Congressional Budget Office said about 2 years ago, if we wanted to close our deficit just by raising taxes, we'd have to double everyone's tax rates. So they literally double for everybody, lower income, middle income, and the rich, double them. And that deficit's getting wider now, so you even can't do that. So we're not going to solve this with tax cuts. In some ways, spending has to be part of the solution. So when you look at this right now, you'll see this is percentage of a GDP of our Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid programs. What I've always found fascinating with this is the blue line Social Security. If you go back to 1962, before 1965 when we had Medicare, generally speaking, Social Security has been a relatively stable program. You've heard me talk about the idea of reforming Social Security. That should be our easiest one to fix because we actually know what the numbers do. We know if we raise the retirement age, what happens. We know if we change the bend points, what happens. We know if we start raising the tax max, what happens. We can tell you what happens by various proposals. Healthcare is different. Economists still aren't sure if we tell you how we want to change healthcare, whether or not those outcomes will actually materialize. Healthcare is a very strange thing, but it's growing very, very fast. And you'll see last year was the first time that Medicare and Medicaid combined to share of GDP and outlays were more than Social Security. Yes, sir.
And this is current law baseline.
Yep. Yep. So and this is where you start looking at what could happen when you take the alternate fiscal. Yeah, well, and we'll get to that. The chart changes dramatically. So and this is one where even if you take the ACA at face value, we still have healthcare costs expanding because we've expanded coverage. I mean, it's just straight math. You can't say you're going to reduce costs and expand coverage at the same time. Yes?
Sorry, that's not true.
You don't think so?
No. There are a lot of democratic industrialized countries that have far lower healthcare costs than we do and far greater coverage.
They have lower costs in some ways per person.
Yes.
But so that's a per capita. So you can lower per capita, but if you increase the number of people you're covering, you're expanding coverage. And what we've done here is, so think about it, if all of a sudden I have for you guys, and I'm only covering just part of the room for healthcare, and I'm not covering these people, but I want to expand into them, but I'm spending $100 per person on you, and I expand them and don't change it, I've now doubled my healthcare costs. But if I lower costs now, I have to lower it by 50% to cover this side of the room without expanding total costs. Well, I'm not sure it is. We haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen those costs reduce. So when you start looking at European countries, how have they sort of controlled their costs? They have what they call QALYs, which means you go in and says, how does this procedure increase your quality of life? How many years of life does it add? So they don't cover all the same procedures that we cover. They don't cover new procedures. So if you think from an economic standpoint, so for those of you who have laptops, PCs, cell phones, have the cost of those products been going down or up? Down. Usually innovation and productivity enhancements causes price reductions. You see it everywhere you look in the world for every product except for one, healthcare. Healthcare is the only industry I can think of in which productivity enhancements increase costs. And again, this is partly because we have sort of the worst of both worlds. We don't have a complete free market system in the US. We don't have a complete socialist system. We have something in the middle where we basically have third-party payers, so the consumer doesn't bear the full brunt of the cost. So they don't make the best informed decisions sometimes. So it's very hard to find ways to control cost in the US, and we haven't done it very well. That's part of the problem we have with the sustainable growth rate in the doc fix. The whole idea behind this was that we said if productivity is 3% a year, then anything that increases above 3% means you're extracting rents from us. We're not going to cover it, and we'll reduce your physician payments accordingly. But we haven't seen those payments come down, so the costs haven't come down at all. So mathematically, could you find some way to expand coverage, reduce costs? Yes. I mean, mathematically you can do it. Have we been able to do it yet? No. And I don't think we're going to get there, at least not yet. When President Obama first came out with some of the original health care reform plans, they actually had some quality control issues that did reduce costs, but they got dropped when it went to the Hill and through the ACA process. So you could do it, but that also means in some ways, I don't want to call it rationing care, it's kind of a bad word, but it means you don't give all care to everybody. You have to find some ways to limit what procedures you cover. So really for our budget though, what's driving this is healthcare spending. I mean, in all seriousness, through anything you look at in the federal budget, defense, transportation, education, in some ways those become small potatoes compared to what we're looking at when it comes to healthcare spending. That really is what's going to drive us to bankruptcy if we don't find some ways to reform the system, reduce costs.
Shouldn't the Medicare or the red line have a dip? We talk about how large the dip should be, but at the end of the baby boomer bubble?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, that's a good question. I haven't thought about that. I'll look. So these are CBO's numbers, so I grab it from them. But that's a good question if you start seeing that drop off. So I think what's happening is if there's a dip because of Medicare in the baby boomers, the Medicaid stuff's still going up. We're also seeing an increase in people who are applying for disability through Social Security. If you qualify for Social Security DI, you qualify for Medicaid. There's a 2-year delay, but you still qualify. So I think what we're seeing is there's a shift between Medicare might be going down, but Medicaid is going up dramatically. I think that's the answer, but it's a good question. I'll look into it. I don't have discretionary spending on here because one of the things I've sort of in some ways given up. The Budget Control Act that went through this past fall basically has $1.2 trillion in savings, and the president's fiscal 13 budget tracks that pretty well for the discretionary side. Based on those, there's roughly $1 trillion in savings going forward. And what's interesting here is what those savings actually are. So the president's proposing savings in his budget, though. He's saying beyond the BCA, I've got additional savings. Have you guys heard what the number is? What is the president claiming he's saving in this budget? $4.3 trillion. That's exactly it. How do we get there? So again, going back to those S tables, so these are the president's summary tables. So again, I just copied this. I haven't done anything with the numbers, so this is the president's budget numbers. And what you see looking at these tables is the bottom corner here. There's your $4.3 trillion in savings. How does the president get there? And you can see, you can walk through 10-year windows, 12 to 21 and 13 to 22. The enactment of 2011 full-year appropriations saves $357 billion. Enactment 2012 full-year appropriations, another $565. Budget Control Act discretionary caps, $681. PAYGO, $7. All right, now the 2013 budget, there's some short-term measures for job growth. That's actually a cost increase of $354. There's tax cuts for families and individuals, $319. Reauthorized service transportation, $117. Expiration of high-income tax cuts, $1.2 trillion in there. So you start adding all these up, debt service, you get your $4.3 trillion. If you do 12 to 21, the 10-year budget window, 13 to 22, you actually get $5.3 trillion. That's what the president says is his savings. Now, what's interesting is a budget is supposed to be a document that says what we're going to do in the future, what we're doing tomorrow. The president is taking credit for things that have already happened. So there's been a lot of discussion going on now about, is the president taking advantage of the savings numbers and misleading you and saying, taking things into account as savings that have already happened. that he can't take accounting for. So if you look at the Center for Responsible Federal Budget and other people who study budgets, they've been saying that the true savings the president should talk about are closer to $2 trillion. So taking this table, let's cross out some of the things the president shouldn't get credit for. So in this, I sort of blocked out and backed off all four of those top four items, which are budget savings that have already happened because of the BCA. So again, think about this idea, the budget are things we're doing tomorrow. I shouldn't get credit for things that happened in the past. These come out right off the top. I've also taken out the cap overseeing contingent operations, the OCO funding. This is the drawdown of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this is money that was never intended to be spending, and the president's taking this as savings and trying to use it to offset additional spending like for transportation. So sort of the idea is if you had basically said we're never going to spend this money, why can you take savings for it? So I had an analogy because someone was asking me about this. Imagine if you went into a car dealership and you would agree to buy a car for $30,000. Perfect, all right? You sign the paperwork, you go for it. Dealership calls you and says, well, wait a minute, we actually made a mistake. The paperwork said that you signed says you bought the car for $60,000. You never intended that. So we're going to change the paperwork for you. Say, great. You go and you sign the paperwork for $30,000 and you walk out saying, I just saved myself $30,000. Where can I spend it? That's what they're doing with the war savings. It's not real savings. There are other things that are in here as well. So for some of the health and mandatory initiatives, in the extenders bill that passed a few weeks ago, there was a technical correction, a fix, to one of the FMAP numbers. When the ACA was passed, there was expanded FMAP coverages for various states that had, say, high unemployment or hurricane. So Louisiana Purchase was one of those well-known things. When they passed it, there was an agreed-upon number that this was temporary, and Louisiana would get like an extra $1 billion, and that was about it. The language is actually written that gave them $2 to $3 billion, and it was a mistake. So in the extenders, they actually had a technical correction. The administration and Congress says that was not our intent. We're sorry, we're just going to fix a technical correction. But they took that additional money and counted it as savings. I mean, based on the way current law is written, you can call that savings. But it was a technical fix. It was never planned to be spent. How do you call that savings? And there's a lot of these gimmicks in here. So debt service. In my mind, paying off or paying interest in the debt has never been a government program. It's not something that's appropriated. It's mandatory spending. We have to pay it. The president was taking credit for decreased debt service because of the initiatives he had that he thought were going to reduce costs. So I backed these out, and if you see when I back them out, I now get down to roughly that $2 trillion level of savings that most budget analysts are talking about the president really is saving in this budget document. So we're not 4.3, we're closer to 2. But then there's a question of, do we think the tax cuts for families and individuals will actually happen? Do we think that the reauthorization for transportation will happen? The healthcare initiatives. Do we think the doc fix is actually going to go through and we're going to see a 27% cut in physician payments? I don't. So you start saying, let's look at what reality is and back out a few more items. You get down to this figure, which basically says that we're really not saving 4.3. We're not saving 2 trillion. If we're lucky, we're saving between 100 and $300 billion. Because we really don't expect tax cuts to expire, at least not all of them. We don't expect the doc fix to expire, right, and have those payments come in. We don't see that happening. So we start thinking about what this is a realistic document. This is your true savings numbers. We are going to hear a lot. We've already started hearing about taxes and revenues and how we're going to get more revenues if we want it and tax reform. Just yesterday, the administration released a general blueprint or document about corporate tax reform, which would lower the rate and broaden the base. What I wanted to show you just quickly today is sort of where we are on revenues. And again, the top solid black line is total revenues, and the lines below break it out by individual income tax, payroll taxes, and corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes, there seems to be now, and President Obama, I give him credit for recognizing this, that our tax rates for corporations are too high, that we need to lower them for competitiveness and job creation reasons, and that we have too many loopholes, we need to broaden the base, as they say. So the idea is you lower the rate, broaden the base. And that's a great idea. Unfortunately, the president's plan he came out with yesterday is sort of like someone handing you $1 with your left hand, and with the right hand they go back and steal a $10 from your wallet. He broadens the base and lowers the rates, but he adds on new taxes. So this becomes a tax increase on corporations, not a reduction, And because of some of the things like a minimum tax on overseas operations and overseas income, it'll probably exacerbate the move for corporations to actually go overseas or reincorporate overseas. It doesn't actually help the problem, it hurts it. But we're going to be seeing a lot of this, and there's a question about where we get revenue from. So you'll see that corporate revenue as a share of GDP has actually fallen. Part is because of transfer pricing areas to move money overseas, part of it's relocation of businesses. We're not going to raise a lot of revenue from corporations, but we need to do real reform that actually helps them do job creation. In a revenue neutral way is fine, but if we really want to get money, we have to reform the individual income tax. And that isn't happening in this document, budget document. It's not happening as far as a proposal, but at some point we have to reform our entitlements, and we've got to reform our tax system, including the individual stuff. Some administration's tax proposals. So one of the things I was talking about is proposed savings, and how do you do savings, and how do you play gimmicks with the budget? This budget is full of gimmicks. So the first one on here is allow the 2001, 2003 tax cuts to expire for incomes above $250,000. That would bring in $970 billion of revenue over 10 years. Now again, the president's making a budget statement that this is where he wants to go forward with his plan and his budget, his vision, which is fine. He gets credit for putting it on the table. What's missing here, though, is let's assume we did this, that we let the tax cuts expire for the high-income individuals, but we kept them for lower middle-income people. All right, if we just did that, what are we missing under current law? The AMT patch. So this plan basically assumes a $3.5 trillion tax increase on middle-class people. There is nothing in the president's budget for the AMT patch. So if the AMT is going to be patched along with this, this isn't $970 billion in savings, it's $2.5 trillion in deficit increases. And this is where you start seeing some of the gimmicks going on in the budget, where on one hand the president's saying, I want to raise taxes on the rich, but I'm not going to account for the fact that I haven't put it in the AMT patch so those taxes don't go up to the middle class. He assumes that we do this, Congress would pass it, and he's right. But he gets to take credit for it in the budget. So there are gimmicks here, these numbers don't add up. Limiting tax expenditures for high-income earners, reduce corporate tax preferences, sort of the same thing here. There is a reduction in corporate tax preferences the president's putting forward and lowering the rate and additional taxes on top. The question is, would this exacerbate corporations to move overseas? Would we actually get that revenue? We're making things better or for worse. There's also things, when we look at tax reform, economists basically want to tax all income the same. We don't want to give preferences. We don't want to pick winners and losers. And we want us to not have industrial policy. And this budget goes further picking winners and losers by the manufacturing credits and incentives for manufacturing. I know politically it's very good right now to go out and say we want to help manufacturing, but why should we give preferential rates to manufacturers? And how do we define manufacturing? So if I'm a consulting firm, which I used to work for, I manufactured reports. Could I call myself a manufacturer and get a lower rate? Lawyers are very crafty. There's going to be a very hard time even determining what's a manufacturer and what's not. And for tax reform, we really want to avoid, again, picking winners and losers. So what I would have liked to have seen yesterday from the administration is saying, but they get credit for recognizing that the rate's too high, and they lowered the rates. They get credit for basically saying there's too many loopholes, let's broaden the base, and that's great. But you'll see lower rates and broader base for all, not just for some select groups and select individuals. So again, this is part way a good tax reform proposal, but not full enough. So there are a lot of things in here, and what we really need to have in a president's budget is proper accounting of how the tax budget and how the tax revenues are accounted for, what's missing, what's not missing. This sort of gets us to debt. So this chart is both gross debt and debt held by the public. CBO basically focuses on debt held by the public. That is their main issue. And the reason why they focus on that is that's what goes out to our credit markets. That's where if we're borrowing and have to compete for borrowers on the open market, that's that debt. And so CBO looks at that debt to say this is what we're considering when it looks at countries' ability to borrow on the market. I also like to add in gross debt because that includes like the Social Security trust funds, which in some ways is an obligation on future taxpayers. So, right now, there's no legal obligation, to be honest, with the trust funds. The Congress could pass a law, the president could sign it, wiping away the Social Security system tomorrow, and all that money could go with it. So, but is that going to happen? No. So in some ways, I like looking at gross debt because that's our obligations to pay going forward, but I want to give you guys both measures. The line going across, the 90% of GDP, economists have basically looked right now and said where countries start reaching the tipping point where they have debt servicing problems is about 90%, when gross debt hits 90% of GDP. We're already past that. Our gross debt is now 100% of GDP. So we're at the point where we're hitting that inflection where we're going to start seeing problems paying off our debt. We haven't so far because our interest rates are comparatively low. One of my colleagues says, we're not the ugliest person at the beauty pageant. Where else are you going to put the money? No one wants to put their money in Greek bonds right now. No one's really putting it in European bonds. Do you want to put it in Latin America? But at some point when the global recovery happens and those countries stabilize, we'll be competing more for those dollars to borrow, which means higher interest rates, higher debt servicing costs, and we start getting the tipping point where our debt servicing costs start crowding out defense, education, healthcare, and everything else. How does this compare? So again, gross debt and debt held by the public. On a gross debt comparison, we're at 100%. We're above Canada, we're above France, we're above Germany, we're a little below Portugal, we're below Italy, we're definitely below Greece. We're actually above Spain. Spain has a lot of financial troubles right now, but their debt obligations are actually low. Their problem is rigid labor markets. If you've studied Greece or know anything about it, they basically have this, it's a very strange system. If you lay off an employee, you owe them 42 days of severance for every year they've worked. So a 20-year employee gets 1.5 years of severance. So it makes it very expensive to hire and obviously more expensive to fire an employee. So they have a lot of temporary arrangements. So Spain has a historically high unemployment rate, about 24, 25%. They're not going to get that down unless they change their labor markets, but they haven't had as much of a debt servicing problem. It really is their employment problem. Japan's different altogether. Japan has what sort of like forced savings. They actually, most of Japanese citizen savings goes into postal bonds. Like if we all saved and bought US bonds as opposed to buying Fidelity and stocks, most of Japan's savings is in postal bonds, so it kind of inflates how their debt servicing ratio looks. But we're at the tipping point. So if you think about Greece, we're not there yet, but we're getting close. Italy has problems. Spain has problems. Portugal has problems. We're near it. If interest rates start rising dramatically, we're going to start seeing those fiscal problems hit us as well. Again, that's gross debt. Quickly, I just want to show you, this is debt held by the public, so that's your preferred measure. How do we look that way? And in some ways there, again, we're well above Canada, we're below France, above Germany, below Portugal, Italy, Greece, a little bit above Spain, and below Japan. So internationally, in some ways, we're getting to that tipping point where we could start seeing some problems. And the problem we're seeing with the president's budget is there's nothing in there that starts moving us towards smaller deficits or even remotely paying off the debt. So our deficits are just adding to the debt, and that debt's going to keep climbing. We're at 15 trillion now. It's going to 26 trillion in the budget window. If we don't do something, we're going to hit a wall. I don't know what that wall is going to look like, but it's not going to be pretty. Just kind of want to wrap up and I'll let some questions. So this is sort of the real bottom line. OMB doesn't develop long-term fiscal, long-term budget scenarios outside the 10-year window. So I have basically CBOs extended based on that's current law, their alternate fiscal scenario, and you'll see that basically this is where the line really shoots up with our debt held by the public, and the purple is the president's budget. So the president in some way is following current law and CBO's extended baseline. That, if his plans come to fruition, and that again, that includes Bush tax cuts expiring, no AMT patch, no doc fix, getting credit for the war savings. If all that happens, you'd see this. We know that's not going to happen. That's our fiscal future. We really need to start seeing a budget that comes out that draws down the deficits and starts paying off our debt, reforms entitlements, and actually takes a real crack at reforming the revenue system. We don't just need more revenues, we need a better revenue system. However you decide what equity looks like, what fairness is, we have a system right now that, if nothing else, the perceived equity is out of balance, and we are doing things that are changing behavior and changing incentives. They're not doing what we want them to do. We're not bringing in revenue. We're not actually creating jobs. We're not creating an environment that has business certainty that they want to create jobs. So until we start seeing a budget that actually tackles these issues, we're going to be on this long-term path, and we're not going to be able to come out of it.